Okay, it's rare that we do this, but I'm going to do it because of this subject. Okay, guys, we'll get started. My name is Manly Sitter. I'm VP Education for ASEM Western Canada. Thank you for registering for this session and attending. It's much appreciated. We wanted to come up with some topics that were very important to members of the chapter and as well to the community. So I'm going to introduce Samuel Roscoe with UBC. And as well, he's going to mention his business background. We'll get right into it. I'm going to actually go on mute, and as well, I'll monitor the chat, and then Samuel will take it away. Please go ahead, Samuel.
Great, thanks, thank you, Manly, and welcome everybody. It's great to have so many of you here today to talk about this subject that I think is on everybody's mind, is really important, affects us either in business or it affects us personally in terms of the costs of day-to-day life. And I'm going to be discussing Trump, tariffs, and trade wars. I'm going to be looking at it really from a supply chain perspective. Just a little bit about me. I'm Dr. Samuel Roscoe, or Sam, lecturer in operations and supply chain management at Sauder Business School at the University of British Columbia. I've worked in supply chains for about 20 years. I worked for Adidas and managed their warehouse for the London Olympics. I've worked in Romania as a supply chain consultant. I've worked in Liberia as a logistician for Médecins Sans Frontières. And I've also worked at Vancouver Airport and Heathrow Airport doing trade and transportation logistics at those locations. So I come from an industry background. I moved into academia, and now I get to have the free time to look at a lot of these interesting subjects. So the perspective that I'm going to take really is looking at what's happened in the past, trying to see what lessons we can take from the past to know about how things are going to turn out and where we're going to go in the future. So I just created a timeline here to really look at how tariffs have been introduced since the first administration of President Trump back in 2017. As you can see there, in March of 2018, Trump announced an intent to impose a 25% tariff on all foreign steel and a 10% tariff on aluminum imports. You can see there by July 1st of 2018, Canada, in our response as a Canadian perspective, we imposed these retaliatory tariffs on 16.6 billion US goods. The things that the Canadian government and the Chinese government as well really targeted were things like steel, aluminum, Harley-Davidson motorcycles, Jack Daniel's whiskey, products that were sort of coming from the heartland of the United States to kind of really target Republican-based states that were manufacturing and exporting these types of products. So the Canadian retaliation was much more targeted, whereas the US had a more broad brush approach in terms of the tariffs that they were implementing. You can see there then, in May of 2019, the US lifts the tariffs on Canadian and Mexican steel. This was part of the renegotiation of NAFTA, moving into the US, Canada, Mexico agreement, or the CUSMA. We then had in July 1st of 2020, the CUSMA was officially signed and brought into effect. We then had, shortly after, in August, Trump actually announced that he was going to impose a new 10% tariff on Canadian aluminum imports, and then Canada immediately vowed to retaliate based on those tariffs. Then, leading into his second presidency in November 25th of 2024, so about 4 years later, Trump threatened to impose a 25% tariff on all Canadian and Mexican products. That was sort of a broad-brushed approach again. Canada's response from the Trudeau government was to actually put in, or to threaten to put in, retaliatory tariffs, again, really targeting the same types of products that Canada targeted in 2018. So this was $30 billion of retaliatory tariffs on US imports, looking again at Jack Daniel's whiskey, Harley-Davidson motorcycles, steel, aluminum, etc. We then had in February 10th, just recently, Trump imposing a steel and aluminum tariff on all imports into the United States. So this is globally as well. This includes China, but Canada and Mexico being particularly targeted due to the amount that we ship into the United States. And the key thing here is with no exemptions. So there will be no way for businesses to seek exemptions from the US government based on different tariff codes or harmonized harmonized systems to sort of get around those tariffs. So looking at this really strict enforcement of tariffs without exemptions, and that could have a big effect on a lot of businesses in Canada and Mexico. So since that time, there's been threats of other tariffs that have been coming sort of fast and furious in terms of executive orders. There has been a new threat to put a tariff on all countries that tax American sales of goods. So, and I'll talk a little bit about that, how Canada has, our GST and PST, and how we are open to be part of a new range of tariffs in addition to the steel and aluminum tariffs that are coming forward. So why does that matter? When we look at this, this tariff that's coming through March 12th for steel and aluminum, why does it matter, especially to the Canadian economy? This graph is looking at US imports of steel by origin country into the United States. And you can see Canada there is in blue along the bottom. And essentially what we are doing as a nation is we have exported about $7 billion worth of steel. And this tends to be sort of raw material, semi-processed steel that is going into the United States. So we are the major contributor of imports of steel products into the United States. You can then see for aluminum, it's even more significant. So in terms of the amount as a percentage of what the US imports in terms of aluminum, you can see that Canada is making up around 48 to 50% of all aluminum imports into the US. In total, we're shipping around $9 billion worth of aluminum into the United States. I'm going to talk about a couple of case studies in a second of why these sort of tariffs become important for Canadian businesses as well as American businesses. Keeping in mind that the tariffs that are being announced by the administration in the United States are import tariffs. That means that they are a tax on goods being imported into the United States. And it also means that it's US companies that are going to be paying those tariffs. And how those tariffs sort of are passed on to consumers then becomes an issue in terms of inflationary pressures on consumers. So how do we learn from the past? What happened when steel and aluminum tariffs were actually imposed in 2018 during the NAFTA renegotiations and the US China and Mexico agreement that came into place? So what happened is steel exports from Canada into the US fell by 38% in June of 2018. And almost a year later, by May of 2019, our steel exports from Canada to the United States were at their lowest level that they have been in almost 10 years. Now, aluminum exports were on average 19% lower per month during the year that the tariffs were in place compared to 2017 and fell overall by about 50% in terms of the amount of aluminum that Canada was exporting into the United States. So what does that tell us that's going to happen now? I mean, with the March 12th, the new tariffs for steel and aluminum come in. It would be reasonable to assume that we will have the same impact on the steel and aluminum industry in Canada. Similarly, if tariffs are applied in a broad brush, all imports or any products that have a sales tax, tariffs are introduced across the board, you would expect the amount, the harm to BC businesses or to Canadian businesses to also be as extreme as we've seen in 2018 with steel and aluminum. So when the tariffs become applied to other types of products that Canada exports, I would expect to see similar types of reductions in sales. And that leads to canceled contracts. It leads to Canadian manufacturers laying off workers. And it leads to inevitably higher unemployment because of our reliance on the United States for imports. So what happened in the United States? Again, it's the US who is actually paying for these import tariffs. From 2018 to 2020, US steel manufacturers added around 1,000 new jobs. So what the intention of the tariffs was to bring manufacturing to the United States. And there were some examples of about 1,000 new jobs being added in the steel and aluminum industries. And those 1,000 jobs were added. Now, the issue, though, is steel and aluminum turn into other types of products, and the US economy takes steel and aluminum and transforms it into higher value-added goods. And the industries that were really affected by these tariffs, it's not just US steel and aluminum companies, it's also how those products are transformed and how they move up the value chain. So companies that were using aluminum to make auto parts or to make motorcycles, to make household appliances, machinery, batteries, military vehicles, etc., suddenly saw an increase in their costs of about 20 to 25% based on the level of the tariff. As a result, there was a study done by researchers at Princeton, and they basically found that by 2019, the companies such as auto parts manufacturers, motorcycle manufacturers, household appliances, the companies that were using steel and aluminum, because their prices had gone up, their costs had gone up, they basically didn't hire as many employees as they would have in those sectors. And the researchers found that there were 75,000 fewer people employed in those particular industries versus the 1,000 people who were employed in the steel and aluminum industries. So you can see there were sort of knock-on effects leading to overall fewer jobs created by the tariffs within the United States. So you could predict, based on what's happened in the past, if we see the steel and aluminum tariffs are implemented in March, you would see this ripple effect going from steel and aluminum up the value chain to auto parts, to things like household appliances and machinery parts, where their costs are going to increase as they're paying for these import taxes. So just to give you a quick case study, I'm going to use a BC brewing. There's a really interesting paper who talks about the effects that tariffs have and retaliatory tariffs have as well. So we have to remember that when the United States has threatened to put these tariffs in place, the Canadian government and the Mexican government have both put or threatened to put in retaliatory tariffs. Those have been put on hold, but we can expect when the steel and aluminum tariffs come into place that Canada and Mexico will also retaliate. So what does that look like? There's a story of the BC craft brewing, so where you're making craft beer within BC. This is a fairly large type of industry, a craft industry within British Columbia. The industry itself employs about 4,500 people in 80 different communities across BC. And the sales of this BC craft beer pumps in around $340 million annually into the provincial economy. Now, what are the tariffs, aluminum and steel tariffs, especially aluminum tariffs in this industry? What do they mean? So the industry itself has already been struggling due to higher costs. There's this article that was in Global News and also reproduced on the CBC, basically said that this industry has already faced a lot of cost increases because of economic uncertainty. And the brewers, what they do is they use aluminum cans to make their beer. And what the article says is that these cans can be potentially tariffed multiple times before they actually receive them and put beer into them to sell. And this is an example of how integrated supply chains are between Canada and the United States. And I'll just give you an example of why this becomes an issue. So in this particular article, we look at how tariffs are applied, and then retaliatory tariffs have also applied. So what happens in the craft brewing industry is we have the Canadian economy that is a very resource-heavy economy. Canadian companies aluminum companies will take all of the raw materials that go into creating aluminum, and they will process it into semi-finished products. And this article talks about the effect that it's going to have on the brewing industry. And you can see there that they say it's basically going to suck because BC craft brewers are bracing for these tariffs. So what happens is Canada in the aluminum sector has a huge smelting capacity. We are a major global exporter of raw aluminum, but what we are not able to do is actually take that aluminum and put it into rolled coils that can later then be made into making aluminum cans or made into car parts, etc. So what ends up happening is that the sheets, so the aluminum companies in Canada will take these sheets, they will ship them down and export them into the United States, and then a US manufacturer will actually convert the aluminum into rolled sheets. And then what happens is those rolled sheets will either be made into an aluminum beer can in the United States, or the rolled sheets will actually be exported back to Canada, and they will be made into the 355 milliliter cans by the brewing company. Now, what happens here is these companies are going to have to pay a tariff. So the US companies importing the aluminum will have to pay the tariff on the aluminum. And if there's retaliatory tariffs put in place, then the brewing company is going to have to pay to re-import the aluminum cans or the semi-finished rolled materials back into BC. So what this sector is faced with is what's called a double whammy of tariffs. They're paying the initial import tariffs, the increased cost of that, and then they're also having to pay the retaliatory tariffs to bring that in. And what the article says is even if it's 1, 2, 3, 4 pennies a can, the margins are so slim in the industry already, it's going to lead to further layoffs, et cetera. So that's just an example of the brewing industry. This is very similar in auto parts. So the auto parts supply chain in Ontario and into Michigan in the United States, heavily integrated. They say between making a car, all of the sub-assemblies, all of the parts that go into the car can actually crisscross the border around 7 or 8 times before final assembly of the vehicle. That means that these companies, especially the car part manufacturers such as Magna and a Canadian company, could be paying for aluminum tariffs. They can then be paying to move the car parts back into a company in the United States, and then bringing the parts back to put them into a subassembly, and then exporting them again to Chrysler, to Ford, to be made into a car. So they could get hit with tariffs 4 or 5 or 6 times by the time that it's the part is actually put into the car and actually turned into a finished vehicle. So when we have retaliatory tariffs, you're hitting companies multiple times in a very integrated supply chain between Canada and the United States. And what that means is when we're faced with threats of new tariffs, it creates uncertainty. And the biggest issue here is companies don't know what to do and they don't know how to respond. And businesses in general hate uncertainty because how do I make a financial decision on where to invest? Do I set up a new production facility in the United States to get around these tariffs? That might cost me several $1,000,000. But then in 4 years, all of the tariffs get removed and I've made this huge investment and I don't get the advantage of the low Canadian dollar anymore because now I'm manufacturing in the United States and selling in the United States as well. So companies, Canadian companies in particular, really have to understand how to manage this business uncertainty. And it's difficult for businesses to make those decisions without knowing which way the tariffs are going to go. This is just an example here of reciprocal tariffs. Trump was talking about Canada's been very bad to us on trade. Now they're going to have to start paying up. Looking at things like digital sales taxes and the new round of tariffs that are supposed to be coming in March are going to be applied on companies outside of the United States who charge a tax, harmonized sales tax, a provincial sales tax to bring goods into the country. So Canada is one country that definitely does that. And one of the things that President Trump is taking issue with is Canada's general sales tax that is used, in their opinion, as a tariff on importing goods. And he wants to create reciprocal tariffs to charge businesses exporting into Canada, or sorry, importing into the United States. So what does that look like? Just very quickly, you can see here that British Columbia, we have a general sales tax of 5%, and that applies across the provinces listed there. British Columbia then has a PST of 7%. So we could be hit with across the board tariffs of 5% on all of our products. Or they could say, well, you have all of these HSTs and PSTs, and we take an average. And if you look across the board, the average of that might be around 8 or 9%. And then you have a broad brush tariff across all products that the US government puts in place for Canadian imports. Okay, so that is something that might be coming up in March based on what the Trump administration has been discussing. So just quickly to show you, because I do want to get into like what do we do about it. But in terms of Canada's trading partners, and I put S in brackets, because you can see that 71% of exports from Canada go into the United States. Those exports are primarily crude petroleum, 18.6%. You can see that's on the hopefully I'm looking at the left side there. Crude petroleum around 18.6%. There's petroleum gas, there's refined petroleum, iron ore. Another big one, of course, is cars and car parts. Gold, in terms of value, is also a significant part of Canadian exports. And there's a number of other things in there, such as sawnwood, potash, fertilizers that Canada is exporting into. So you can see underneath our exports, 71% to the United States, 5.4% to China, 2.3% to Japan. And this was in 2023. So heavily reliant as an economy on the United States. And, of course, any type of tariff that is introduced will impact how Canadians interact with its largest trading partner. In terms of imports as well, you can see that this is a Canadian imports of products where what we are importing is machinery, mechanical, appliances and parts, electrical machinery and electronics, cars, tractors, trucks, and those types of parts. You can also see where are we importing it from. Of course, the United States, 50.6% of all of the value of our imports is coming from the US, followed by China at 11.3%, Japan at 2.7%, and then Vietnam here. So again, you can see that the Canadian economy is heavily reliant on imports from the US, although it is a little bit less and slightly more diversified than our exports into the United States. So just quickly, what has China done? I mean, we can look at other countries as examples of how they've handled it. And one of the interesting things that I found while I was doing research for this talk is that actually China has responded to its exports of steel and aluminum into the United States in a different way. What China has done is it's actually began to collectively diversify outside of the United States and looked for alternative markets. So what I did is I just looked at what are the Chinese exports of steel and the iron that goes into the steel in 2018. And this is when the tariffs were introduced. You can see there that South Korea and Vietnam were already China's biggest trading partners for steel. The United States is actually fairly low in terms of its overall percentage of exports of steel. But at the time, it was around $700 million in terms of value, and it was about 1.4% of the total export value of Chinese steel. Now, what happened is that from 2018 until 2023, Chinese exports of steel actually significantly increased. It went from 48.7 billion up to 66 billion. So that's roughly, about a 48% increase in terms of how much it was exporting. But you can also see at the same time, the export value into the US went down. It went from 700 million down to 617 million, and it dropped as an overall percentage from 1.4 down to 0.93. So what the Chinese businesses, as well as with government support, it looked into this strategy of diversification of its markets. And it said, okay, well, instead of trying to get around this 20% tariff, we're no longer competitive in the US market. We need to look for other sources and other markets. And you can see here that it began to balance its sales into South Korea, Vietnam. Turkey became a larger market at 4.75%. And India as well started to take in more steel from China. So the key sort of takeaway from this is that the Chinese government, as well as Chinese businesses, recognize the uncertainty. They recognize how uncompetitive their products become with these tariffs. And instead of trying to sort of petition for exemptions or using free trade zones and doing all of these other things that a lot of American businesses are doing, as an industry, it looked to diversify to other types of markets, such as South Korea, Vietnam, Turkey, and India. Okay, so I'm just going to talk about, in the next sort of 20 minutes, what I call my 5+1 strategies for managing geopolitical uncertainty. And essentially, just the 5 strategies I'm proposing. The first one is called diversification of the upstream supply chain and our downstream markets, which I'll get into. The second strategy is about coordinated work between policymakers, business leaders, trade associations, and academia, such as myself, on building supply chain resilience initiatives. Strategy 3 is looking at sort of the reduction and removal of interprovincial trade barriers, something that the Association of Supply Chain Management has been talking a lot about over the past sort of 4 or 5 months. Strategy 4 is this idea of moving up the value chain, which I'll explain in a bit more detail. And then strategy 5 is about regionalization and vertical integration of global supply chains as a way of managing all of these risks of geopolitical uncertainty. So the +1 strategy is digital transformation. So creating a more sort of digitally enabled supply chain in order to sort of have increased visibility of risk and disruption and give the companies the ability to move sources of supply as disruptions happen. So strategy 1 is this idea of diversification of suppliers and markets. So using China as an example of in the steel industry, of how do we see this uncertainty in the US market and begin to move away from it. Now, I will acknowledge, of course, that Canada is right beside the United States. It is the largest consumer market in the world. And this idea of diversification is much more challenging due to our geography and also due to our sort of historical trade agreements with the United States. But it is certainly possible, and looking to balance that overall trading partners is something that is achievable, but it may take some time. So what does that look like in terms of diversification? What have we been seeing sort of since COVID, as well as since, the US-China trade war? So I would say 2018, 2019, up until today in 2025, there has certainly been a shift in sort of global trade policy. And by that, the US has certainly leaned towards protectionist measures, especially during COVID. And in the Biden administration, they came up with the Supply Chain Act, and that was all about protecting critical industries such as semiconductors, EV batteries, also protecting vaccines, and looking at how to develop sort of localized supply chains to protect those key industries. The European Union has actually gone in a similar type of direction. They've developed the European Chips Act, and that is, again, about having capacity to make semiconductors within the European Union instead of having to rely on Samsung in South Korea or TSMC in Taiwan. And they want to bring that capacity within to the EU. And the European Union has been somewhat different because they're also looking at this idea of friendshoring and looking at how to work with what they call friendly trading nations, such as Canada and New Zealand, Australia, etc. I did a lot of work with the Department of International Trade in the UK during COVID, and some of the recommendations that I'm going to put forward come from that work that we did. And I see some similarities between the UK economy and the Canadian economy. Our GDP between these two economies is similar. You can see the GDP for the UK there is 2.67 trillion in 2024. And for Canada, it's about 2.16 trillion. So in terms of our overall economic size and our economic clout in the global marketplace, it's similar. And we don't have the resources that the EU does. We don't have the resources that America does. And what the UK government did, especially during COVID, is that they realized they won't be able to onshore everything. They won't be able to protect all of their critical markets. They can't come up with $5 billion to set up a new foundry to make chips. So what then they have to do is they have to invest in diversification strategies. And the UK came up with a really interesting, and I won't go through the entire thing, but they sort of identified 5 pillars of how to deal with the COVID disruptions that came globally and how to protect their key industries. In the UK, their key industries were construction equipment, it was military equipment, it was vaccines, it was semiconductors, it was EV batteries. And those industries they considered critical, as well as water and veterinary medicine. And they wanted to come up with a strategy in order to protect those markets. And the Department of International Trade and myself, we did a lot of work on developing sort of these 5 pillars. Now, I'm not going to get into all of them, but generally the key pillars that they really focused on was diversification of their suppliers into their key industries, and also developing more international partnerships, okay? And all of that is underpinned, as you can see along the bottom there, with what's called data and visibility. And this is the idea of having more digitalized supply chains, better support for industry in terms of onboarding of digital tools and digital technologies, and actually giving financial incentives for especially small and medium-sized businesses to do that. The other thing is policy levers. So what can they do in terms of reducing trade barriers, kind of going in the opposite direction of the US? How do they reduce trade barriers to enable this idea of diversification in their industry supply chains? So one of the interesting things that I found, though, is that when we were talking to business managers and when we were talking to sort of policymakers in the UK, is that they see supply chains very differently. Business managers are very focused on their own supply chain for their own company and maybe the competitors that they're directly competing with, okay? So such as Apple and Samsung, they might have very good awareness of each other's supply chains. Now, that is sort of what I call a micro bottom-up perspective of the supply chain, looking at how do I manage my SKUs, how do I manage my procurement, and where do I buy from, where do I source from? Now, policymakers look at supply chains very differently, and this was really a key insight for me, is they take a much more critical industry, strategic industry approach. They're looking by sector. They're looking at electrification. They're looking at semiconductors. They're looking at AI technology, and they're looking at sort of the supply chain by an industry or sort of strategic level. And one of the key things that I've argued for is that the supply chain, global supply chains, are which really connect those two perspectives. And why that's important is when we talk about diversification, we tend to think about businesses and diversifying a couple of things. So first of all, you can diversify the products that you sell. You can diversify instead of just selling, one type of product. I'll give you an example of the Apple iPhone and the iPhone 16. Apple is now looking into having different and lower price ranges of its products to be more competitive in China and India, for instance. So it's beginning to diversify the types of phones that it sells into different markets. You can also look at diversifying your suppliers. So instead of having all of your supply coming from the United States into Canada, we look at having a backup supplier in the European Union. And when tariffs are put in place, we can shift our procurement from the US to the European Union as sort of a way of mitigating the risks of tariffs, okay? So this idea of diversification is really about spreading risk across your global supply chain. So when a tariff is introduced, you can move your production volumes. What businesses are doing, and what I found is you might have 80% with your key supplier in the United States and 20% with a backup supplier, let's say in the European Union. And you might pay more for the European Union supplier, but the thing is when tariff is introduced or when you have an issue with a supplier in the States, you are then able to move that production volume to your backup supplier and ramp up production relatively quickly instead of having to start from scratch and create a new supplier and go through all of the regulatory issues that come with that. So that's happening a lot, this idea of having backup suppliers, dual sourcing, multi-sourcing. It's becoming very, very prevalent in industries such as pharmaceuticals as a way of managing global risk. Some of the other things is, diversifying geographical sources of supply. Again, not having everything in North America, also looking at the European Union, looking at Southeast Asia, the Asian nations, as a way of beginning to spread your risk. Now, when we look at this, companies are very focused on, of course, their profit, their bottom line, growth of the firm. But policymakers then are looking at diversification a little bit differently. They're trying to diversify strategic sectors, and they want to make sure that the economy is diversified across. In the UK, is very finance heavy. Of course, in Canada, we're very resource heavy. And the idea here is how do policymakers begin to sort of stimulate other types of industries so we're not so reliant on one particular sector. And industrial policy is then targeted at things like developing the aerospace industry, developing pharma, developing construction, and making sure that the Canadian economy is not so reliant on resource heavy industries. Also looking to diversify import and export mix. So how much are we importing and where is it coming from? And this idea of moving up the value chain, which I'm going to talk about in a second. The key role that policymakers, of course, is forging those international trading relationships, really working with BC businesses, with Canadian businesses to actually open up more avenues from trade outside of the United States. And it really does take government to do that because the negotiations will happen at a government level. And of course, policymakers have to look at diversifying their geographies to avoid types of issues that can come up with COVID, natural disasters, etc. So the key focus for policymakers then is on increasing GDP, growth, supply chain continuity. So really, how do we kind of bring this together is business leaders and policymakers have to see supply chain diversification in the same way. It's diversifying the industry, sectors, where we're selling to, and who we're sort of getting our supplies from, and looking at a lot more broad base outside of the United States from a Canadian's perspective of how we're sourcing products and who we're selling into. So looking at opening up better trading agreements with Vietnam, India, also emerging markets in South America, et cetera. I know Canada has done a lot in terms of trade agreements with the EU, and taking that type of model and beginning to apply it in different areas. So the whole idea here is that business leaders and managers begin to see supply chain continuity as the ultimate goal. It's not just about the profitability of the firm or the GDP growth from a policy level. It's about the continuity of supply and ability to make sure that we have supply to meet domestic demand, as well as the ability to export into new and emerging markets. And that has to happen between policymakers and business leaders. So really, this comes into this idea of coordination on supply chain resilience initiatives. And I would argue here that policymakers and business leaders, they have to coordinate and find a shared perspective on supply chain resilience. And really, this idea is how do we kind of get policymakers, government administrators to really understand supply chains from a business perspective, but also vice versa. How do business leaders understand supply chains from a critical industries perspective, from a strategic sector perspective, outside of their own supply chain that they're obviously concerned about? I argue that trade associations are the real sort of linchpin between this. They're the ones who represent small and medium enterprises. They need to play a role, a coordination mechanism between policymakers and business leaders, and academics and consultants, arguably as well. What our job is to kind of is to give voice to SMEs in government policymaking, academia to provide training to businesses and government leaders about trade policy, the effect of disruptions on global supply chains, and also looking at tools such as supply chain mapping and getting better visibility. So this idea of, how do we bring policymakers, business leaders, and how do we all sit down at the same table? The idea there is, making sure that we are mapping our supply chains, that we actually have an understanding of where our suppliers actually are. And some companies have a good understanding of your tier 1 suppliers, maybe your tier 2 suppliers, but arguably the majority of businesses don't actually know where their raw materials come from. And they don't really have a good idea of tier 3 and tier 4 of the supply chain. And that's why sort of getting this visibility, doing the supply chain mapping exercises are so important. And really, with policymakers and business leaders, you're really trying to understand what is the critical industry, critical items, critical inputs into my supply chain. And you begin with those and you begin to map those out, because that can take a lot of time. And you begin to sort of move up your supply chain to make sure that you're looking at all of your inputs across tier 1 all the way back to tier 4, and having that end-to-end mapping. And it's a very hard and time-consuming thing to do, especially if your company has thousands of suppliers. This can become a very arduous task, but it needs the support, again, of policymakers to understand how complex our supply chains are. So this is just a quick example, and I'm not going to go through all of this, but this is just some work that we did with the UK government on supply chain mapping. The reason why I like it is you can see the black lines are actually sort of the tiers of the supply chain. So at the bottom, you have tier 1 going into tier 2. And this is actually an EV battery supply chain, and looking at the recycling there. And the mapping exercises that we did is you just look at the end of the life of the battery and how it's recycled. The nice thing about it is it actually shows you who are the companies, the key sort of critical companies there. You can see then in the tier 2, we're looking at where are geographical locations that we're sourcing from. So here was France and Sweden, Germany. You can see then who are the key players put here in blue. Then we move into sort of the third tier of the supply chain, where we're looking at extracting the carbon, the cobalt, the nickel from the batteries for reuse, processing those batteries again. Who are the key countries that are involved in the supply chain, showing them here on the right side. then getting into sort of tier 3, tier 4, for example, and the different countries that are involved in that. So that's just a quick example of some of the things that businesses, policymakers, academics, trade associations could be doing to really understand global supply chains and how complex they are. Now, the third third strategy that I would recommend is really focusing on removing interprovincial trade barriers within Canada. There is a movement online, social movement, and as I'm sure a lot of Canadians have been aware of, a Buy Canada. Where can I source, Canadian dog food from? Where can I source Canadian household appliances? There's a lot of Facebook groups that are growing. There's one group that I've been involved in that has grown from about 1,000 members, sort of Buy Canadian, up to about 1 million members now, all across Canada, looking for different sources of Canadian products. But we can't do that if we have these interprovincial trade barriers that exist. So the third strategy is about tackling and removing interprovincial trade barriers. And I'll just go through this quickly. Some of the examples of these barriers are restrictions on the sale of alcohol between provinces, technical barriers, especially around transportation, truck sizes, truck weights, having to actually get out and weigh, measure the truck, and actually having to change the different types of gauges and containers of moving materials in between BC and Alberta. And that can create a lot of delays and costs in the movement of products, and really unnecessarily. Regulatory barriers such as licensing, health and safety, differences between provinces, and then also paperwork requirements. So internal trade accounts for nearly 1/5 of Canada's GDP. And some of the estimates that I just found from the International Monetary Fund is that Canada could increase its GDP per capita by as much as 4% through changes to internal trade restrictions or the removal of these internal trade barriers. So what's happening now in this space, just quickly, Anita Anand, the Federal Transport Internal Trade Minister in Canada, has probably optimistically said that all of these trade barriers could be removed in about 30 days. And this was actually just at the beginning of February, so the clock's ticking on that one. But there is, a big impetus now at the sort of the federal level to actually tackle this province by province and bring together all of the different provinces to make sure that these trade barriers are removed in order to now enable more internal trade between provinces. There's just some other things. There's the development of the federal framework of mutual recognition. There are these frameworks in place, but it's again about implementing them and following them through, getting the buy-in of all of the provinces, and actually bringing these barriers down. And then there's also the internal trade action plan, actually following through all of the steps that have been outlined in that as well. So lowering provincial trade barriers is a huge win for the Buy Canada movement that is going on at the moment. The other thing is just this idea of moving up the value chain. This is really important for Canadian businesses. The Canadian economy is so raw material focused, processing that raw material, turning it into sort of semi-finished goods, and then exporting it to the States, like the aluminum can example, taking those aluminum cans and then shipping them back into Canada. It just seems like the real win here is moving up the value chain. And again, this might take Canadian steel and aluminum producers 2, 3, 4 years to set up the production facilities to do this. This might be a longer term sort of approach. But basically, this smiley curve of value creation argues that the manufacturing and assembly of the supply chain is right down where the sort of the added value is. Where the added value comes from is moving into services or taking products and actually making them into more value-added products and moving them up the value chain. And that is where we begin to capture more of that value add. And BC businesses, as well as all the steel and aluminum smelters across Canada, there is a big potential to move up the value chain here. And I'll just give you an example of some of what those look like. So just in aluminum, where we are kind of at the moment in Canada, generally, and I'm speaking generally here, is we are taking the bauxite, we're doing the refining, we're doing the primary production. So we're sort of in this red box. Where the value added could come from is taking those flat sheets and then looking into the processing, putting them into the rolled aluminum sheets, doing the casting, the extrusions, the forging, and then turning those products even further in secondary production or moving them into other types of product markets. So making them into automotive parts, building and construction parts, etc. And this is the idea, again, of moving up the value chain for Canadian raw materials. The other one is just on steel and aluminum. This is the example of steel again. Where Canada businesses are really is around semi-finished products, the rolling of steel, the making of flat steel plates, and moving up the value chain in this instance is then how do we take those flat plates and make them into rolled sheets, make them into products that actually could be consumed directly in the construction industry, for instance. And the advantage of that is if we're diversifying markets, you have products that can then be chunked up and sold to China, to India, to the European Union, and your transportation costs in theory would be less than having to sell raw materials or semi-processed goods because you were able to put them into more finished goods and then sell them overseas. So moving up the value chain also helps with the diversification process. This is just an example of a company called Flex Electronics, US-based company that's now operating out of Singapore. What they do in terms of the value chain is they used to make circuit boards, or they still do, but they've actually gone further than just making the product. They do the design and engineering now. They actually manage global supply chains of companies that that buy their products, and they have fantastic supply chain towers and visibility of end-to-end supply chains. Probably one of the leading companies in the world of actually having end-to-end visibility. They're also doing advanced manufacturing on behalf of customers, so they will make circuit boards and chips for their customers. They also do the post-production process, so looking at forward logistics, value-added fulfillment, delivery solutions for their customers, optimizing routes, etc., using their traceability and visibility systems, and then looking at the post-sale, so how do we get the products back, recycle, and reuse those products on behalf of their customers. Okay, so just quickly, the last strategy is around regionalization and vertical integration. And this is more for Canadian multinational companies, or if you're from other parts of the world, looking at how do we manage risk. And one of the biggest trends that I've seen since COVID and global supply chains is a move away from making everything in China or making everything in Indonesia or Singapore, which is this sort of centralized production model, and then sort of shipping it all over the world. Okay, so this is country A, we make it here, we make it in China, we ship it into Canada and to the United States. That model was really focused on cost minimization in the supply chain, using low-wage labor, making products, and then sort of shipping it overseas using relatively low-cost transportation, such as ocean freight. That model has been totally disrupted by COVID and the rolling shutdowns in China, zero COVID policies in China, etc. And what we're seeing now is a big movement towards regional specialization. And the idea there is the company will have plants that are set up around the world. And if there is any risk of a new tariff being implemented in, let's say, China, then production volumes can be moved to another location. The other strategy is vertical integration. I'm just quickly give two examples of that just before I wrap up. So what does regional specialization look like? This is the idea of what I call production volume swapping. And this is, again, where we need the support of policymakers to look at policy levers such as reducing tariffs for work in progress inventory that is moving between these different regional hubs. And if you are taking a semi-finished product in China, and you are, let's say, Tesla, for instance, and you have to shut down that facility or tariffs are implemented, moving that capacity to another facility, not having to pay for the transportation of intermediate parts between your different regional hubs. So as an example here, I'll just give you Tesla's sort of footprint around the globe. They have a gigafactory in Berlin. They have one in Shanghai now. They also have a gigafactory in New York and Fremont and Nevada. So basically, they have a regionalized supply chain design where they're setting up gigafactories here in North America for sales in North America. The one in Berlin sells to Europe, and the one in China sells to China and Southeast Asia. The idea here is that these regional production hubs, if there is a new tariff, instead of supplying from China into the United States, I would supply from Berlin into the United States, or I would make things locally and sell within the US, depending on the tariff. So this regional sort of supply chain design gives companies a lot more flexibility in how they manage risk. It is more expensive, clearly, having 5 hubs instead of 1. You have all of your capital costs, your overhead costs. But it is now taking the supply chain and looking at it as a competitive weapon, looking at it as a way of a risk mitigation, instead of just seeing the supply chain as a cost center. And businesses have been really, really focused on, let's keep my supply chain costs down as low as possible. But it doesn't matter if your supply chain is really low cost if you can't get your products onto store shelves to sell to customers. So this idea of regionalization gives you more flexibility in your supply chain. So that, again, that's just the idea of swapping between facilities. The other one is vertical integration. We're just looking again at Tesla. They've really disrupted the automotive industry. What Elon Musk has done is he's gone out and he's actually bought lithium mines. He's going right back to the raw material source, buying the mines themselves and sort of operating those. He's trying to take over battery production as well from Panasonic, as well as from CATL in China, and making their own batteries. They take the aluminum rolled coils that I talked about earlier, and they actually stamp those into automotive parts. And they actually are able to make their own cars within their own facilities within about 5 business days, versus the industry standard that has outsourced everything else to places like China and India, and has much longer supply chains. So vertical integration reduces your risk because your supply chain, you have visibility of your into supply chain, but you also are able to understand if there is a disruption, how to manage that because you have that increased visibility. So just to wrap up, the last strategy is what I call this +1 strategy. And really all supply chains need this, but not all supply chains can afford this. And the point is that digitalization of supply chain flows to increase visibility and transparency, which I'm sure most people understand. Things like blockchain, really good at transparency from end to end of the supply chain. A lot of work has gone on with Maersk and IBM in managing supply chain flows using blockchain. The other one is, of course, generative AI, predictive analytics. Companies such as Blue Yonder, Kites, offering really now sophisticated supply chain management software to manage that end-to-end supply chain using generative AI. So the 5 strategies that I mentioned earlier are underpinned and supported by this supply chain digitization strategy that also needs to happen. Otherwise, you don't get that visibility that you need to manage risk. So just in conclusion, to wrap everything up, really the key takeaway here is we need a coordinated approach between policymakers and business leaders to create this sort of shared perspective on the supply chain, not just industry sectors and strategic sectors from the policy perspective, and not just your own supply chain from a business perspective, but kind of bringing that understanding together at a global supply chain perspective and really looking at supply continuity, managing supply chain risks, visibility through supply chain mapping exercises, et cetera. And that is supported by trade associations, like I said earlier, by academia, where we are helping to facilitate those types of conversations. And then also much needed financial support from provincial governments as well as federal governments for businesses that cannot afford the digital transformation costs, getting loans, getting funding that these businesses can use and pay back. Okay, so I'm just going to leave it there. And I want to leave not much time, but for questions that come up as well. So thank you, everybody.
So if you have any questions, just come on chat or just come on mic. Okay, so just a comment. Thank you very much. Very insightful presentation. Thank you. Okay, Martin, great session. Any questions?
Sam, I wonder if I could just ask a question about timing. Most of the commentary around diversification is not something that can happen overnight, and the threat of tariffs exists in the landscape which the background to which is the Trump presidency, which is not forever, one assumes. And therefore, everything you said makes perfect sense in terms of the nation and the charts you put up that showed the relative value by percentage of imports and exports shows quite clearly that there's a crying need for Canada to diversify its supplier and customer base. But how likely is it that we'll suffer a lot of short-term pain in the knowledge that in 4 years' time the landscape will be different?
Yeah, thank you for that. I've actually spent a lot of time thinking about the exact same thing. And the question is do we make, as businesses, do we make these investments knowing that maybe in 4 years the entire administration changes, the tariffs are removed, we're best friends again, and everything's fine. And what I found in my experience, especially because I went through Brexit, I lived in the UK during Brexit, and what a lot of the businesses did there, especially I interviewed GSK as a UK pharmaceutical company, and what they did is they went for the worst case scenario, which was dropping out of the European Union, having no customs union, and having sort of no ability to sort of have a free movement of trade. And what GSK did is they did worst case scenario planning. And they said that in the worst case, if this happens, then we will have to set up a new facility in Europe to manage the import of goods. And they actually invested $60 million for a new facility 2 or 3 years before Brexit actually happened. And they did that because they didn't want the uncertainty and they didn't want to continue to deal with this what if, let's wait and see, maybe then if we'll do that. And they made a strategic decision to invest in Europe because they felt, well, that's the worst case possible outcome. And I really think businesses now, because it's happened once in 2018, it's happening again now. And the reality is the Biden administration actually kept a lot of these tariffs in place, especially against China. And I think businesses are really beginning to wake up to, well, you have a very uncertain market in the United States. And really, then we have to look at a diversification, the costs of doing that. Okay, it might change in 4 years, but at least we've made that, we're going down that path now. We've made those investments, and now we actually have a clear way forward because businesses don't like uncertainty. And I think that investment happens because you want to remove that risk by making those initial investments. That's just been my experience. I know that applies for GSK, which is a hugely well-off, multinational corporation. Much harder for small and medium-sized businesses to do, and that's why I really think they need the support of the BC provincial government as well as the Canadian government to begin to make these investments. But I do think it has to happen because just the risks are too great.
Okay, we have a question from Phil. Do you think the government will start looking at in-house strategies rather than focus on retaliatory actions?
Yeah, good question, Phil. I mean, what I've seen is an immediate retaliatory sort of hymn sheet from the Canadian government as well as the Mexican government. I think when these tariffs are implemented in March, I think Canada will retaliate, and I think Mexico will as well. And that will be the sort of the knee-jerk reaction. I think in terms of in-house strategies, like I said before, Phil, one of those is, removing interprovincial trade barriers. That is an in-house strategy that the Canadian government could be moving forward with now, in addition to retaliatory tariffs. And they could also be better supporting businesses in terms of export strategies and diversification strategies. So I think you kind of have this basket where you have a focus on retaliatory tariffs, which will happen just because I think the governments need to appear to be doing something and appear to be strong and in control because it wins votes, etc. But at the same time, sort of behind the scenes, we need to be having these domestic in-house strategies happening as well. Otherwise, we are just paying the cost of tariffs, and I don't think that it benefits anybody.
Okay, and Gigi has a question. If a finished good is being transported by ground directly from Mexico to Canada, is this impacted by tariffs?
Yeah, good question, Gigi. I actually looked into this. So as part of the USMCA or CUSMA, however you want to call it, goods that are shipped from Mexico in directly through the United States by ground into Canada would not be impacted by a US-based tariff because they are actually not landed in the United States and they're not being sold in the United States. So if you have a bill of lading that is showing going from Mexico to a customer in Canada, it would not be subject to any new US tariffs because, believe it or not, the USMCA is actually still in force, kind of, and you wouldn't be actually subject to new tariffs that are being introduced by the Trump administration.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? Okay. Once the reduction of interprovincial trade barriers is done, more or less, when can we see the impact on GDP? This is from Harold.
Yeah, good question, Harold. I mean, I think that is going to take time. And I think if the barriers are reduced, like I said, the IMF said that there would be a 4% per capita increase on Canada's GDP. I would think that's probably going to take 2 or 3 years, though, to actually trickle through as we begin to kind of have increased movement between provinces, sales between BC and Alberta, and actually companies selling, looking towards Canadian markets instead of the US market. That will take several years, in my opinion. And I do think this Buy Canadian movement is actually going to move that forward a lot quicker. There really does seem to be a lot of sort of social angst around the tariffs. And I do think, consumers are really making an effort to buy Canadian. So that will also help boost the GDP effect on by moving the interprovincial trade barriers.
Actually, Sam, do you have any comments on the Buy Canadian movement?
I mean, I think generally I think consumers are looking for something to do. And I think, Canadians are sort of like, well, they feel like the US is breaking up with us a little bit, meaning that we've had this trade agreement. The US we've had this trading relationship that's been in place for so long. Everything's going so well. We have all of these integrated supply chains, and then all of a sudden we're breaking up. And I do think there's a lot of sentiment in Canada, and a lot of people are getting behind this Buy Canadian movement. And I really see, especially on social media, Facebook, TikTok, monitoring what my kids are doing online as well. They're all talking about it. And I do actually think there is a lot of growth in this area. And I think you're going to see already Canadian companies branding them as made in Canada. And I think that made in Canada brand will become very important to Canadian consumers.
Great, thank you. Any other questions, guys? Okay, well, thank you everyone for attending. Timing's great. Thank you very much, Sam. Much appreciated. And again, everyone, thanks for attending. One quick note, we will be posting a course on processing tariffs, paying for tariffs, and that Greg Henderson, who is with Export Spark, did a presentation for us a couple weeks ago, and he will be coming back early March 11th, to do a session. So I'll be posting that in the email that I send out to you guys following this session. Thanks again, everyone. Much appreciated. And if there is no other questions, we'll close off. And again, thank you very much, Sam.
Thank you very much. Thanks everybody for coming.